When I stepped into the backyard that morning, the sky was so clear it felt as if all the world's problems had vanished. The soft sunlight filtered through the garden, glinting off the dew-kissed grass. This was my favorite time of the day, peaceful, quiet, and completely mine. I unrolled my yoga mat in the middle of the yard, right beneath the shade of the old oak tree. Matthew had left early, as usual. He was always busy with work, leaving me behind in this large, silent house, surrounded only by cold walls. People looking in would call me a lucky woman, but they didn't understand sometimes, silence could feel like a prison. Inhale. Exhale. I began my routine, feeling the stretch of each movement. Yoga wasn't just about maintaining my health, it was where I found balance. Here, I wasn't Matthew's wife or Liam's stepmother. I was simply me, Olivia. Liam. He had moved in with us a few months ago, but the distance between us was still as wide as when he first arrived. Liam wasn't intentionally rude or defiant. He simply kept his distance, as if I were an uninvited guest in his life. I understood that. I could never replace his mother, the woman who passed away years ago. Nor did I intend to. But his coldness sometimes made me feel invisible. He was like a shadow passing quietly through my days, leaving no trace behind except for fleeting glances. Or maybe I was wrong. Recently, I'd noticed that Liam often appeared in the mornings while I practiced yoga. I wasn't sure what he intended, but I could feel his gaze on me from the living room window, a curious look, but not intrusive. Interesting, I thought. Liam might be distant, but at least he seemed a little curious about me. As I finished a sequence of sun salutations, the familiar stillness of the garden enveloped me. But then, the sound of light footsteps on gravel shattered the peace. I turned around and saw Liam. He stood at the edge of the yard, hands tucked into his jeans pockets, his high. The morning sunlight illuminated his youthful face, creating a peculiar moment I couldn't quite name. "Good morning," I said, trying to keep my tone as natural as possible. "Morning," Liam replied, his eyes flicking from the yoga mat to me. "Do you do this every day?" "I try to," I smiled, straightening up. "It helps me feel better." Liam nodded, his hands still buried deep in his pockets as though weighing something. "Yoga seems interesting." I tilted my head slightly, sensing a teasing note in his voice. "Want to give it a try?" I asked, almost certain he would say no. "Sure, why not?" Liam replied unexpectedly, catching me off guard. Without waiting for another invitation, he stepped onto the mat beside me. He was clumsy, just as I'd expected. Even the simplest poses, balancing on one leg or bending to touch the ground, threw him off. Every time he stumbled, I had to stifle a smile. "You don't have to laugh," Liam said, looking up at me with a mix of embarrassment and irritation. But then, he couldn't help grinning himself. "I've never done this kind of thing before." "That's okay. Everyone struggles at first," I replied, keeping my tone light, trying to encourage him. "Let's try this pose. Focus a bit more, okay?" I stood beside him, guiding him on how to balance better. "Don't let all your weight fall on your feet. Shift it up to your hips, and keep breathing evenly." Liam followed my instructions, his brows furrowing in concentration. But just as he seemed to steady himself, he lost his balance. "Careful!" I exclaimed instinctively, reaching out. But instead of catching him, I felt his entire weight collapse onto me. We both fell onto the grass. I landed flat on my back, and Liam fell on top of me. His face was only inches from mine, his wide eyes staring into mine, filled with confusion. I could feel his warm breath against my cheek, mingling with the scent of wet grass in the crisp morning air. Time seemed to freeze in that moment. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, and maybe he could, too. His weight, his awkwardness, it made my face burn. Even though I practiced yoga regularly and my body was fit, Liam's tall, solid frame overwhelmed me. My breathing grew heavier, and his gaze seemed locked onto mine. I wanted to say something, but no words came out. "Sorry," Liam whispered, his voice rougher than usual. His arm brushed over my chest as he moved. The small touch felt like a spark, making me flinch. "It's okay," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, though the turmoil inside me was impossible to hide. He extended a hand to help me up. I hesitated for a moment before taking it. His palm was warm, and as I stood, his gaze lingered on me longer than necessary. We stood facing each other, neither saying a word. The air between us felt oddly charged, indescribable. I turned away, picking up my yoga mat, trying to regain a sense of normalcy. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice slightly shaky. "I'm fine," Liam replied, though I could see he was trying to mask his embarrassment as well. After a few seconds of silence, Liam stepped back. "I think I should go inside," he said, his eyes flickering uncertainly. "All right. Thanks for trying," I said, managing a small smile. But my heart was still racing. He nodded and walked away quietly. I stood there, watching his figure disappear into the house, my chest filled with indescribable emotions. The way he looked at me, the way I could feel his breath so close. I knew I shouldn't think this way. But the feeling lingered, refusing to fade. That night, as I sat alone in the living room, the image of Liam falling toward me played over and over in my mind. His gaze, that closeness, all of it shouldn't have happened. But why couldn't I forget? I told myself it was just an accident. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. There was something about Liam that made me feel seen, noticed, a feeling I hadn't experienced with Matthew in a very long time. I didn't do yoga the next morning. Not because I was tired, but because I didn't know how to face Liam. Since yesterday morning, I'd been trying to push his image out of my mind. But no matter what, those moments kept coming back, like a recurring film I couldn't turn off. I sat on the sofa in the living room, looking out at the garden through the large window. Sunlight filtered through the trees, painting shimmering patterns on the grass. I saw Liam step into the yard, wearing a simple t-shirt and old jeans. He stood there, glancing around, as if searching for something. I knew I should keep my distance. But instead of looking away, I stayed seated, watching him from afar. That evening, when Matthew returned, everything was as usual. He walked into the house, placed his briefcase on the table, and asked a few polite questions like, "How was your day?" or, "Do you need anything?" before disappearing into his office. I was used to this, his presence felt like a fleeting shadow. But tonight, his silence unsettled me. As I cleared the dinner table, I glanced at Matthew sitting before his computer, so engrossed he didn't notice I was there. Perhaps in another world, we could have talked more. But this wasn't that world. The next morning, I decided to return to the garden. I didn't want to abandon my routine because of one incident. Spreading my yoga mat on the grass, I began my familiar poses, trying to focus on my breathing and bodily sensations. But this time, Liam didn't just watch from a distance. He approached. "You're doing yoga again?" he asked, his tone more casual than I expected. "I always practice at this time," I replied, trying to keep my voice even. "Do you want to join?" He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Sure. But this time, I'll be more careful." He sat on the mat beside me, and we began the session. I noticed that Liam was trying harder than before. He was focused and diligently followed my instructions. Though still clumsy at times, he didn't seem frustrated when I corrected him. "Straighten your leg more," I said, gently adjusting his posture. When I placed my hand on his shoulder to guide him, I felt him pause for a moment but said nothing. "Is this better?" he asked, his voice low and rough. "That's good," I replied, trying to ignore the strange feelings stirring within me. That afternoon, I heard a soft knock on the door of the attic, where I kept my paintings. Before I could respond, Liam walked in. "You're here?" he asked, his eyes scanning the room filled with colors. This is where I paint," I said, feeling slightly awkward that he had seen my private space. "You never told me you could paint," he said, stepping closer to the easel where an unfinished painting rested. "This is beautiful." "I didn't think it mattered," I said, trying to hide my embarrassment. But Liam's gaze, sincere and admiring, made me feel seen in a way Matthew never had. "You should let people see these," Liam said, lightly touching the painting. "You're really talented." I looked at him, unsure how to respond. How long had it been since someone complimented me like that? I couldn't remember. But Liam's words, though simple, soothed deep wounds I hadn't realized were there. That evening, as I sat alone in the living room, Liam walked in holding a sketchbook. "This is yours, right?" he asked, holding it out. I nodded. I'd forgotten about it. "I found it in the attic." "Could you teach me how to draw?" he asked, his eyes sparkling with curiosity. I smiled, feeling a strange sense of relief. "Sure. But don't expect too much. I'm just an amateur." We sat at the table, and I began teaching Liam the basics. He listened intently, his eyes full of focus. In that moment, I forgot everything else around me, just the brushstrokes, the sound of pencils gliding over paper, and the quiet connection between us. "Why do you like painting?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Because it makes me feel free," I said, without much thought. "When I paint, I don't have to worry about anything else." "I get that," he said, his eyes briefly clouded with a sadness I couldn't decipher. As I lay in bed that night, the image of Liam sitting with the sketchbook lingered in my mind. He was youthful, passionate, and attentive in ways I hadn't expected. But the emotions stirred by this left me more confused than pleased. I wondered, is there something wrong with this relationship? Or am I just imagining things? But deep down, I knew something had shifted, not just with Liam, but within myself. Each morning, I started my day with my yoga mat. But now, the atmosphere felt different. I no longer felt the solitude of the quiet backyard. Liam seemed to have turned my routine into his own. He stepped into the yard at the same time each day, bringing with him a mischievous smile and a curiosity I couldn't ignore. "This time, I'll do better," Liam said, settling onto the mat beside me. "That's fine, but if you fall again, don't take me down with you," I replied, trying to mask my unease with a bit of humor. We began our session together. Though he was still clumsy, I noticed his genuine effort. Liam wasn't merely mimicking my movements, he was trying to understand how his body moved. His concentration sometimes caught me off guard. "How long have you been practicing?" he asked as we rested on the mats after finishing the routine. "About 10 years, I answered, gazing up at the clear blue sky. "It helps me balance everything. When I practice, all my worries seem to fade away." "Does Matthew practice with you?" he asked, his tone casual, though his eyes held a subtle curiosity. I gave a faint laugh. "Matthew isn't the yoga type." Liam said nothing more, but a flicker of understanding crossed his face. I wasn't sure what he was thinking, but in that moment, I felt a sense of connection I hadn't experienced with Matthew. That afternoon, as I painted in the attic, Liam appeared again. He carried a small wooden frame I'd left downstairs. "I thought you might need this," he said, setting the frame on the table. "Thanks," I replied, smiling. "Do you want to try drawing again?" Liam nodded. "I've been thinking about the last lesson. Maybe I should give it more effort." We sat at the table, and this time, Liam wasn't just listening to my instructions. He actively asked about colors, composition, and how to convey emotion through strokes. He wasn't a naturally talented artist, but his enthusiasm made me happier than any compliment ever had. You seem to enjoy this, I said, watching him mix colors. Maybe because you make it fun, Liam replied, glancing up at me. You really love art, don't you? I paused, my eyes lingering on the unfinished painting before me. I do. But I haven't always had the chance to pursue it. Why not? He asked, his voice filled with curiosity. Matthew thinks it's impractical, I said, unable to hide the sadness in my tone. He doesn't understand why I'd spend time on something like this. He's wrong, Liam said, his eyes lighting up with sincerity. You shouldn't give up just because someone doesn't understand. Liam's words, simple as they were, struck a chord deep within me. Perhaps because it had been so long since I'd heard something like that. The next day, during a yoga session, I guided Liam through a new pose, balancing on one leg with his arms raised. As usual, he tried his best but lost his balance. He stumbled toward me, and before I could react, we both toppled onto the grass. You really need to focus more, I said, trying to keep my tone light as we sat up. But this time, the contact between us felt different. When our eyes met, I noticed Liam's face turn slightly red. He avoided my gaze, but his awkwardness was unmistakable. I, too, felt my heartbeat quicken. Sorry, I'm so clumsy, Liam muttered, his voice quieter than usual. It's fine, I replied, though deep down, I knew everything was far from fine. After that day, I began noticing Liam watching me more often. It wasn't an uncomfortable gaze but a quiet, respectful attention. He observed me while I painted, mixed colors, or focused on refining the details of a piece. And I couldn't deny that I, too, began paying more attention to him. The way he smiled when praised, his determination to perfect each stroke, and his openness in sharing his thoughts, these little things made me feel closer to him than anyone else. Yet every time I caught myself thinking about Liam in ways I shouldn't, I felt a wave of fear. This wasn't right. This wasn't how I was supposed to feel. One evening, when the house had gone quiet, I heard a soft knock at the living room door. It was Liam. I can't sleep, he said, holding a sketchbook in his hand. Can you show me how to draw? I hesitated briefly but then nodded. We sat on the sofa, the warm glow of the table lamp enveloping us. I guided him step by step, occasionally taking his hand to adjust his strokes. Each time our hands touched, a strange sensation spread through me. Thank you for teaching me, Liam said when we finished. His gaze lingered on me a moment longer before he left. I remained on the sofa, my heart racing faster than it should. I knew I was treading a fragile line, between right and wrong, between what should and shouldn't be. Olivia began to realize that her feelings for Liam were no longer just the care of a stepmother. But she also knew that continuing to grow close to him would only make everything more dangerous. Would Olivia be able to control her emotions? Or would she allow them to lead her down a path with no way back? I told myself that everything would be fine. That the confusing emotions I'd been feeling were just fleeting reactions, like a gentle breeze passing through but never staying. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more I realized I was lying. There was something between me and Liam, something vague yet too real to ignore. Matthew came home later than usual, but this time he didn't head straight to his office like he always did. Instead, he sat down across from me in the living room, his gaze fixed intently on me. "How was your day?" he asked, but his tone lacked the casual indifference it usually carried. There was something in his eyes, curiosity, perhaps even suspicion. "It was good," I replied, trying to sound natural. "I did yoga, painted a little, then cooked dinner." "Same as always." "And Liam?" he asked, making me pause. "Is he getting along with you?" "He's fine," I said, carefully keeping my emotions in check. "He helped me a bit in the garden, and we talked. Matthew nodded, but his eyes didn't leave mine. I couldn't tell what he was thinking, but the feeling of being scrutinized left me more uneasy than ever. The next day, Liam suggested we work in the garden together, tending to some old flower pots he'd found in storage. He said the garden needed more life, and I agreed. We worked in silence, but it wasn't the uncomfortable kind. I enjoyed how patient and meticulous Liam was with each branch, each leaf, as if everything held its own significance. "Do you ever think you deserve more?" Liam suddenly asked, breaking the tranquil atmosphere. I looked at him, unsure where the question had come from. "What do you mean?" "You're talented, passionate. But you keep hiding it, like you're afraid someone might notice," he said, his gaze serious. "Don't you think you deserve to be appreciated more?" His words made me freeze. I could feel the sincerity in his voice, but it also made me uneasy. He was seeing parts of me that even Matthew had never seen. That evening, as I worked on a new painting in the attic, Liam knocked on the door. "Am I interrupting?" he asked, holding a mug of hot cocoa. "No, come in," I replied, surprised but not refusing. He sat in a chair near me, placing the mug on the table. "I want to watch you paint." I continued painting, trying not to focus on his watchful eyes. But when I accidentally spilled a jar of watercolor, Liam rushed over to help. In that moment, our hands met on the table, and we both froze. I looked into his eyes, and for that fleeting moment, I couldn't deny what I was feeling. But I also knew it wasn't right. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice lower and rougher than usual. "I'm fine," I said, my voice trembling. I think you should go back to your room." Liam stared at me for a long moment before nodding. "I understand. Good night." The door closed behind him, and I sat there, feeling like I'd just weathered a storm. I knew I couldn't let this continue, but my heart refused to obey reason. A week later, during dinner, Matthew unexpectedly spoke up. "Olivia, you and Liam seem to have gotten closer lately, haven't you?" I set my knife and fork down, trying to stay calm. "We're just trying to get to know each other better." "Really?" Matthew raised an eyebrow. "I thought you didn't care much for him." "Matthew, I'm just trying to do what's best for this family," I said, my tone firmer than usual. "He's your son, and I want him to feel comfortable here." Matthew fell silent, but his expression betrayed his dissatisfaction. I knew he didn't fully trust me, but there was nothing more I could do. That night, after Matthew had gone to bed, I went downstairs to get some water. I was startled to find Liam sitting on the sofa, his gaze distant as he stared out the window. "Why aren't you asleep?" I asked, stepping into the room. "I've been thinking about a lot of things," he said, then turned to look at me. "Do you think sometimes we can't control our emotions?" I froze. His question struck a nerve I was trying so hard to bury. "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Maybe emotions are the hardest thing to control." Liam stood up and moved closer to me. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable, Olivia. But I think I can't pretend anymore." "Liam, don't say anything else," I whispered, feeling my heart pounding harder. "We can't." But his eyes, earnest and intense, silenced me before I could finish. We stood there, motionless, the space between us so fragile I could feel his breath. But before anything could happen, I turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the darkness. Olivia realized that her relationship with Liam had crossed the boundaries of what she could control. But could she stop herself from succumbing to temptation, or was this just the beginning of an irreversible chain of mistakes? I told myself it would pass, that if I kept my distance from Liam, everything would return to normal. But it wasn't as easy as I imagined. Every time I saw him, it felt as though I was standing on a fragile tightrope, a single gust of wind away from plunging into an abyss. The next morning, I decided not to practice yoga in the backyard. I needed time to think, to realign my emotions. But as I walked into the kitchen, I saw Liam standing by the window, holding a cup of coffee. "You're not heading outside?" he asked, his tone light, though his eyes carried a deeper meaning. "No. I thought I'd try practicing indoors today," I said, trying to appear casual. "Can I join you then?" he asked, offering a faint smile. I froze. His question sounded innocent, but I knew better. "I think I'd rather practice alone today," I replied, doing my best to keep my voice steady. Liam nodded, though his eyes betrayed a hint of disappointment. That evening, Matthew announced that he'd been invited to an important charity gala over the weekend. "Do you want to come with me?" he asked, his tone devoid of excitement, as if it were merely an obligation. I looked at him, searching for any sign that he truly wanted me there. But his eyes remained fixed on his computer screen. "Sure," I replied, though my heart felt hollow. Liam sat silently across the table, his gaze quietly lingering on me. I could sense the tension in the air, as though each of us carried a secret we dared not speak aloud. "Liam, you should start attending events like this," Matthew said, breaking the silence. "It'll be good for building relationships for the future." "I don't think I'm suited for such events," Liam replied, his tone calm but with a subtle defiance. Matthew raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. I felt a small wave of relief, though I couldn't explain why. After dinner, I went to the kitchen to clear the table. Liam walked in, placing a plate on the counter beside me. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low. "I'm fine," I said, though I couldn't hide the slight tremble in my tone. "You don't seem fine," he said, stepping closer. "There's something happening between us, isn't there?" "No, Liam." "There's nothing," I said, turning away to avoid his gaze. "You can't keep lying," he said softly but firmly. "You know it as well as I do." I set the plate down and took a deep breath. "Liam, I'm older than you. I'm your father's wife. This is wrong, and we can't let it continue." "But feelings can't be wrong," he replied, stepping even closer. "I've never felt this way about anyone before." His words left me speechless. I could hear the sincerity in his voice, and that only deepened my confusion. But before I could respond, Matthew walked in. "What's going on?" Matthew asked, his eyes darting between us. "Nothing," I quickly replied. "We were just talking about dinner." Matthew raised an eyebrow but said nothing more. He walked away, leaving Liam and me standing in a tense silence. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, desperately trying to find a way out of this mess. But the more I thought, the more trapped I felt. When I went downstairs to get a glass of water, I found Liam sitting on the sofa, his gaze distant as he stared out the window. "I knew you'd come down," he said when he saw me enter. "Liam, you shouldn't be doing this," I said, my voice catching. "We need to keep our distance." "You say that, but is that what you really want?" he asked, his eyes piercing through me. I didn't answer. I didn't know how to answer. And before I could react, Liam stepped closer, his eyes filled with a determined intensity. "You're afraid of this because you know it's real," he said, his voice low but heavy with meaning. I turned and walked away, but my steps were slower than they should have been. I could feel his eyes following me, and I knew this was only the beginning of an inevitable chain of mistakes. The story reached a crescendo as Olivia and Liam's relationship neared the point of no return. Would Olivia find the strength to escape the storm of emotions, or would she let it consume her completely? I locked myself away in the art room for days after that night. The brushes, watercolors, and canvases became my final refuge. But even in that private space, I couldn't stop thinking about Liam's eyes and his words. "You're afraid of this because you know it's true." I hated that he was right. I hated that I couldn't deny it. That evening, As the three of us sat down for dinner, the tension was thicker than usual. Liam was silent, his head bowed as he ate. I tried to remain calm, but Matthew's scrutinizing gaze never wavered. "Olivia," Matthew suddenly broke the silence. "You and Liam seem awfully close lately." I set my fork down, trying not to show my unease. "I just want him to feel more comfortable living here." "Comfortable?" Matthew smirked. "Seems like you're spending more time with him than with me." "Matthew, don't make this into something it's not," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm not making anything up," he replied coldly. "I just want to understand what's going on." Liam abruptly stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I'm not hungry anymore," he said before storming out of the room. Matthew's eyes followed him, suspicion written all over his face. "Is there something going on between you two that I don't know about?" My heart raced. "No, there's nothing," I said, but my voice wavered. That night, I sat in the living room, trying to focus on a book but failing miserably. Liam walked in, holding a mug of hot cocoa. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. "No," I admitted, more honestly than I had in a long time. Matthew's starting to suspect. "We need to stop this before it goes too far." "Stop what?" Liam asked, sitting down beside me. "We haven't done anything wrong." I looked at him, feeling the weight of his sincerity in his eyes. But that was the problem, we hadn't crossed any lines physically, but emotionally, the boundaries had long been breached. "Liam, we can't keep this up." "You have to understand," I said, my voice cracking. "Don't you get it?" he replied, his voice trembling. "You're the only one in this house who actually cares about me. Matthew has never treated me as anything more than a shadow. But you see me." His words cut deep, piercing through my defenses. I didn't know how to respond. But before I could say anything, Matthew walked into the room, his face dark with suspicion. "What are you two doing here?" he asked, his voice low and commanding. "We were just talking," I said, trying to sound calm. "Really?" Matthew stepped closer, his gaze settling on Liam. "Then why are you here so late?" "Dad, I don't need to explain myself," Liam said, his tone defiant. "You do need to explain," Matthew said sharply. "I'm not an idiot. I've been watching you two for weeks now." My heart stopped. I stared at Matthew, trying to gauge his thoughts, but his eyes were already fixed on Liam. "Speak," he demanded. "What's going on between you and Olivia?" "Nothing," Liam replied, though he couldn't meet Matthew's gaze. Matthew turned to me. "Olivia, I'm asking you. Do you have anything to say?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Matthew's cold, unrelenting stare told me he wouldn't believe anything I said. In the days that followed, Matthew's behavior changed. He became distant, cold, and guarded, towards both Liam and me. I didn't know if he truly believed there was nothing going on, or if he was simply waiting for the right moment to confront us. One evening, Matthew unexpectedly called both Liam and me into the living room. He sat in the armchair, his eyes sharp and piercing. "I've hired a private investigator," he said, his voice calm but heavy with authority. "And I know everything." My heart sank. I glanced at Liam, who looked just as shocked as I felt. "Matthew, what are you talking about?" I asked, trying to maintain composure. "Don't pretend, Olivia. I know you've crossed the line." "I know everything," he said, his gaze drilling into me. Matthew now held evidence, or at least enough suspicion, to challenge Olivia and Liam. Everything was teetering on the edge of collapse. Would Olivia be able to explain her actions, or would she have to face the bitter truth? The once quiet living room now felt suffocating under the weight of an invisible pressure. Light from the chandelier reflected off cold, unyielding walls, casting a heavy shadow over a space I couldn't escape. Matthew sat in the armchair, his fingers tapping lightly against its edge, his sharp gaze cutting into me as if dissecting my every thought. "I've seen the way you look at Liam," Matthew said, his voice steady, though simmering with restrained anger. "And I've seen the way he looks at you. Don't deny it, Olivia. I want the truth." I stared back at him, my throat dry. "Matthew, you're misunderstanding," I said, my voice trembling. "There's nothing going on between me and Liam." "Nothing?" he repeated, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "Then why is he always hovering around you? Why do you let him into your private space?" Liam suddenly stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Dad, that's enough. I don't want to hear any more," he shouted, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and desperation. "Sit down, Liam," Matthew roared, his voice echoing through the room. "Do you think I don't know? Do you think I can't see what you're trying to do?" "I'm not trying to do anything," Liam shot back, his eyes blazing. "I just want to feel seen, to feel heard, something you've never done for me." I stood frozen between the two men, feeling torn apart by accusations and painful truths. Matthew turned his bloodshot eyes to me, filled with hurt and betrayal. "Tell me, Olivia. Who do you choose?" I wanted to say something, to deny everything, but my silence only made things worse. Liam looked at me, his eyes filled with hope but also fear. "Olivia, you don't have to endure this anymore," Liam said, his voice softening. "You don't have to stay with him if you don't want to." "Shut up, Liam," Matthew shouted, slamming his hand against the armrest. "You have no right to say that." But Liam didn't back down. "She deserves to be happy, Dad. And you've never given her that." Matthew stepped forward, standing toe-to-toe with Liam. "What do you know about her?" he demanded, his voice low but brimming with authority. "You think you can replace me?" "No, but at least I can care about her," Liam replied, his gaze unwavering. Matthew turned to me, his eyes demanding the ultimate answer. "Olivia, tell me. Have you betrayed me? Do you love him?" The question struck me like a knife. My mind swirled, but I knew I couldn't keep avoiding the truth. "Matthew, nothing happened between me and Liam," I said, my voice breaking. "But you pushed me to this edge. I don't feel loved or seen anymore. And Liam, he's the only one who cared." "The only one who cared," Matthew repeated, his voice dripping with bitterness. "So this is my fault, isn't it? My fault that you couldn't keep your boundaries." I didn't reply. I had nothing left to say. The next morning, when I woke up, Liam was gone. He had left a note on the kitchen table. "Olivia. I'm sorry for making things harder for you. I never wanted you to suffer. Maybe I shouldn't have been here in the first place. Thank you for making me feel seen, even if it was only for a little while. Liam." I held the note in my hands, a hollow emptiness spreading through me. He was gone, taking with him the tangled emotions I couldn't unravel. Matthew didn't say anything about Liam's departure. He remained silent, as if everything had been resolved. But that silence brought no peace, only a reminder of the irreparable crack between us. I stood in my art room, staring at the unfinished paintings I no longer had the inspiration to complete. Liam was gone, but he had left a void that Matthew could never fill. I knew I would have to keep living, but I wasn't sure how. Perhaps I would pour myself into my art, trying to rediscover who I was in the strokes of paint. But would that be enough to heal the wounds I carried? Somewhere, I hoped Liam would find his own path. And maybe, someday, I would find mine too.